And as far as we know, because it's not mentioned in the Bible,
it says the springs of the great deep.
Yeah, fish.
Wherever that is.
Based on what we know, based on the Bible, fish were not destroyed here in the flood. They survived the flood. Because it talks about destroying animals that either walked on the ground or flew in the sky, in the air. Nothing said about fish. So, just a little trivia for you to work on.
Unless they couldn't live with the desalination of the
Right,
water.
right. The saltwater and freshwater mix, and some of them couldn't survive that. But for the most part, the fish survived. If you did not receive a schedule with your book, I've got some extras of that too. Just kind of let you know what weeks we're going to be studying what. And the sermon outline, the sermon will go along with that. Also want to remind you that we have postcards and flyers to hand out or mail, depends on the situation. And you say, well, the series have already started. I don't need to do that. Well, we got 30 weeks to go. And people can jump in and come in and, anytime during the series. So, and if you want to know a detective way of how to address the postcard to people that you don't know, you go to the Okaloosa Property Assessor site and put in just a street, and it'll give you people's names and their address. So you can put in, I did that for part of Destin, and I found a guy that I went to college with his sister. I didn't know where he lived, and he lives over this way. Also, Cash's liquor stores, y'all seen those around?
Yeah.
I sent him a postcard. He was on the list I was working off of, and I said, you know what? Should I or shouldn't I? And finally I said, I'm going to do it. So hopefully I planted a seed. He's going to close up all of his liquor stores. Yeah,
Take down those horrible billboards.
He might bring us some smoothie ingredients.
Different kind of smoothie.
Want me chocolate banana, that's it.
You're losing your class.
Let's keep going. All right, lesson 2. Abraham, God builds a nation. I've given you the timeline based on what the book gives me. Also, there's a subtitle, What Sin Changes, Faith Overcomes. So let's get started. Last week we learned how Adam and Eve became unrighteous because they disbelieved God's word. By contrast, this week we'll learn how Abraham believed God's word and was declared righteous. Through a brand new nation called Israel, God will reveal his presence, power, and plan to get us back. Every story of Israel will point to the first coming of Jesus, the one who will provide the way back to God. I've heard it said, and Gary Conley alluded to it this morning, the entire Old Testament points toward Jesus. The 4 Gospels tell you about Jesus, and the rest of the Bible points to his second coming. So all through the Old Testament, we're going to be directing our attention toward Jesus. Give you a lesson breakdown or an outline, you could call it. Abraham called into God's promise. And you notice there's some New Testament references there we'll talk about. Abraham takes things into his own hands. The covenant of circumcision, the promise fulfilled, the test, and then Israel established. So points of the story for this lesson. God calls Abraham out of the darkness of pagan idolatry into the light of true fellowship. God works through a covenant, making Abraham and his descendants his chosen people, marking out a special land for their inheritance and promising to bless all nations through Abraham's family. When Abraham and Sarah, let me just say this. Through this, in your notes, you're going to see Abraham and Sarah spelled out in their new names sometimes when it should be their old names. I apologize for that. It's just I didn't catch it as I was going through it. So that's my little word here. When Abraham and Sarah try to make God's plan work through their own efforts, things get very messy, and God Jesus promised miraculously giving Abraham and Sarah a son in their old age. 1 generation later, Jacob would produce 12 sons of his own, and the nation of Israel would be born. You guys will get the video? Okay. We'll show today's video. One thing I want you to be aware of and watch out for, and we'll talk about it after the video, is at the close to the very end, he's going to quote John 3:16. Listen real closely to his following statement about Moriah and Golgotha in Jerusalem. So it comes, you see that John 3:16 statement comes up, and he talks about it's the next quotation or next comment he makes. I want you to pay strict attention to. We're going to talk about it. that Golgotha and Mount Moriah is the same place? Handful of you? Let there be light. This is a big debate, and Gary mentioned that. Gary actually mentioned it this morning. There's a lot of disagreement about it. And part of the disagreement comes to the fact that when David built Jerusalem, the Mount Moriah, or Moriah, was inside the wall, Golgotha was outside the wall. So when you read John 19:17, it tells us that Jesus carried his cross, went out to Golgotha, which means he went outside the city of Jerusalem. But I will tell you this, most people do believe they are one and the same. And the reason is, like Gary mentioned this morning, it's the same area, or probably the same hill that Abraham was fixing to sacrifice Isaac with, encounter to where God sacrificed his son. So most people do believe they are one and the same, to the point, as you actually look at the scripture, it says mountains of Moriah, where usually you talk about Mount Moriah being one place. So there is some debate, but most people do believe they are, if not the exact same hill, at least close enough to be considered that. Also, Mount Moriah is where Solomon built the temple in 2 Chronicles. He mentioned that, and it's where the Dome of the Rock exists today. Anyone ever been there? Y'all are fixing to go, right? Y'all been, you've been, Rob's been. My brother and sister-in-law just got back from there. So I sent him a text last night and said, did your guide ever tell you this? He said, no. I said, you're no help. Anyway, that's the story behind that.
He didn't say that Moriah was Golgotha. He said that Moriah was the place where Jerusalem was built, which is
Correct. But then he said later, 2,000 years later, that was the place where Jesus was crucified. And Gary mentioned that this morning. Isn't that right? Was I listening correctly? Yeah. Most people do believe that. And I'm not here to argue one way or the other. I'm just pointing out the arguments. So, anyway, let's get into the story. God asked Abram to do what? Genesis 12:1, page 13 in the book. Yeah, leave your native country, your relatives, your father's family, and go to the land I will show you. Did Abram throw out excuses for not doing so? No. Of course, then the story continues on. Let me ask this, because this is a question on your handout. What are some of the common excuses we use today when we want to get out of following God's lead or instructions? Or
it's not my gift.
not my gift? Okay, that's a good one.
That's Old Testament stuff.
It's Old Testament stuff.
God didn't really mean that for me. He wants me to be happy.
Yeah, and I've heard, I've heard it said many times that, especially with the letters of the New Testament, they were written to those folks, not to us. You ever heard that one before? So that's another one. How about I'm too busy? You ever used that one before, or heard someone use that one?
I have other plans.
I'm too old.
I did that before.
I've done it once before, so I'm not going to do it. So then, on page 14, we read about Abram and Lot separating. Their flocks had grown so big that the land couldn't support them, so they separated. We know the story that Lot, of course, moved towards Sodom. We know the story there and what happened there. What made Abram righteous in God's sight? Page 14 and 15. His belief? His faith? Yeah. Genesis 15:6. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. And then Romans 4:22 said, because of Abraham's faith, God counted him as righteous. Feel free to just pop in with a question or a statement if you have one. So what do we learn about Abraham and Sarah? This is actually Abram and Sarah's faith from Hebrews 11:8 and 9. Again, Gary alluded to it. Well, basically what Hebrews is telling the story about Abraham, about God telling Abraham to go, leave, pack up his stuff and leave, and Abraham leaving, or Abram leaving. He did not question God. He just went up, he just packed up his stuff and left.
And God tells him, I'll give you this land, but they never built a house or a city. They only dwelt in tents.
Right, you get to live in a tent. I'll pause in just a second. This is just flavor of water.
The cash is on the way to churches. Drop off the invitation.
Actually, I have met him and talked to him. When I was working in Fort Walton, there's a Subway restaurant, sub sandwich place not far from where I work, and he would come in there and talk to him and eat sometimes. And he's an Auburn alumnus, so we started talking Auburn football, and
He's old as Abraham.
he is, and he looks it too.
Yeah.
Wasn't he the owner of the, the night, that place at the corner?
I don't know.
What was it?
The Green Knight.
The Green Knight.
Oh, I don't know.
That, yeah.
You are showing your
We're
age.
too young to remember.
That's been a long time.
Because he was, whoever owned that place, was the one that gave us access to it, because when Hurricane came through and destroyed a lot of Destin,
Oh,
that was
that
where
was part of it.
yeah, part of what, we were issuing out, stuff, lots of stuff.
I don't know. I mean, he may have. He owns a lot more than just a liquor store, so I can tell you that. So anyway. Where are we? Number 5. When Abram was 75 years old, God promised him what?
Will make you a great nation.
Yeah, I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. And then on page 15, that came from page 14, which is Genesis 13:16. Then Genesis 15:5 on page 15, he does what? What does God tell Abram?
That his descendants would be
Like the stars.
Like the stars. Yeah, he compares his descendants like the stars. So God is basically telling him there's going to be a lot of folks that come from your family. Then page 16, Abram believed that the promised child would come from his own body, but God had not specified that Sarai would be the mother. So after 11 years, and here again, Gary spoke about this, Sarai did not think God was moving fast enough with this whole nation-building project. So she decided to help God by giving her handmaid to Abram to bear a child. I'm going to disagree with Gary on something. He said that Abram was 99 years old when Ishmael was born. 100?
yeah.
That is not
was
correct.
Isaac.
That is not correct. Yeah, that's Isaac. That's how old he was with Isaac. He was
85.
86. Compared to Genesis 6.
Sometimes I get my words crossed. I'm glad we're paying attention. Anybody else gets it? I did that on purpose. Thank you, Lynn.
Genesis 16:16 shows he was 86. So.
I hate we video our sermons because I can deny it.
By the way, video.
I've mentioned that Gary has in the kit there's an outline for Gary to use, and Todd, I don't know what Todd's going to do, but for Gary to use for the sermon, and I have access to that. I have a copy of that, so I know what his points are supposed to be, but I have no clue what he's going to say.
I don't either.
And I sent you an email last night, and you never responded. So, but you didn't cover what I was asking, so we're okay.
I'm sorry.
Because I didn't want to double up. So. Why is it so hard to be patient and wait on God's will for our lives? Sarai was losing her patience. Why is it so hard for us to do that today?
It's a lack of faith. We can't see the upper story.
Can't see the upper story, and we cannot see what, David?
Time and space.
Time and space. Here we go. We live in time and want things to happen in accordance with our view of the right timing. God, on the other hand, lives outside time, and because of that, He can see when the perfect timing is for everyone and every event. So, yeah, we don't know what the upper story is completely, and therefore, God's moving at His own speed and His own time, and we just have to accept it. And because we are human, like someone said, we get real anxious at times, don't we?
Yes.
So, any comments?
We grow up in a 30-minute world.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you grow up sitting in front of the TV, and there can be a murder, and it's solved in 30
Yeah,
minutes.
it's solved in an hour.
So we grow up in this
Yeah.
30-minute world, so we think if it takes more than 30 minutes, it's too long.
Yeah. I've heard it referred to as a microwave world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our microwave died last week, so we're having to learn how to cook in an oven and on top of the stove. So anyway, any other comments about that? Our patience or lack of?
It's nice to know that it wasn't just us. It started way back.
Oh, yeah. So on page 16, and it comes from Genesis 16:15, Hagar gave Abram a son, Abram named him Ishmael. When Abram was 99 years old, God reminded him of his covenant from Genesis 13:16, which is on page 14 again, but added a stipulation. Let's back up a minute. What was this covenant? From Genesis 17:2, on page 17 in the book. Okay, it's called first of all, he reminded Abram that he was going to have countless descendants. That's what I'm looking for. He reminded him of the guarantee of having countless descendants. The stipulation is in Genesis 17:10 and 11, and like Deborah said, that's called the covenant of circumcision. And it's very detailed, so you can read that if you haven't already. Genesis 17:10 through 11. What did God do to Abram in Genesis 17:5 and Sarai in Genesis 17:15?
Change your name.
Change their names. And what did the word Abram mean? Y'all remember from the video?
Yeah.
Someone said, Father. Excuse me. Exalted Father, some translations have. And what does Abraham mean? Father of many. And then Genesis 17:15 talks about Sarai also. What does Sarai mean? Princess. And what does Sarah with an H mean?
Queen.
Queen. Some translations say my lady. So just depends on what you're looking at. So on page 18, Abraham and Sarah have a son they named Isaac. How old was Abraham and Sarah when Isaac was born?
Around 100.
Do we know here? Abraham was 100, Sarah was 90. That's on page 18 in your book. It comes from Genesis 17:17. It's also repeated, or at least Abraham's part is repeated in Genesis 21:5 that he was 100. There's a lot of jealousy between Sarah and Hagar. We would say today they probably had a few cat fights. Abraham is caught in the middle. On page 18, what does God tell Abraham in Genesis 21:12 and 13 to assure him about Ishmael? What did God tell Abraham what's going to happen to Ishmael? Gary mentioned it.
God said he would be a great nation as well, but he would not be through whom the covenant or the blessing from God would be through Abraham.
Correct. God did tell him that Ishmael would have a great nation, but he's not the great nation that God was talking about earlier.
My favorite part there is where it says, listen to whatever Sarah said.
Yeah, yeah.
That's Old Testament, by the way.
Yeah, that's Old Testament, yeah.
Yeah, I'm old.
So how many sons did Ishmael have? Does anybody know?
12.
12. It comes from Genesis 25, 12 through 16. That's not in the book. That's just a little extra credit. So the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac have been living happily ever after ever since. And Gary gave us the history on that.
You think they had daughters too, or and they just didn't?
Oh, I'm sure they had daughters, but remember back then, females were just collateral, so to speak. You know, they didn't count.
They were not part of the lineage.
Right.
And they went to the house of the son. So it was only the house of the sons that counted,
Yeah.
that were named. With the exception of Jacob, whose daughter is named, and David, whose daughters were
Yeah,
named.
there's a few daughters that are named.
Yeah, David's daughters are named,
A few and far.
and Jacob's daughters named.
That answer your question, Wayne?
Yeah, I didn't know that
Yeah, they had daughters. We're pretty sure they had daughters. They're just not named for the most part. So, little information for you. I gave you, and here again, it's not in the book, but we read it in Galatians 4, 21 through 31. It references Abraham's two wives that represent two covenants. Galatians 4:24 says that Paul says Hagar represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. Verse 26, Paul says Sarah represents the heavenly Jerusalem. So let's move on. What was the name of the place God led Abraham and Isaac to? Mount Moriah.
The region, the NIV says the region of Moriah.
It does say that. And even in your book, it says the mountain, where we would usually say a mountain. It's a mountain range, is basically what Moriah is. So that gets confusing sometimes. And as we've already talked about, Moriah is later referenced as Jerusalem, the city of reference, Jerusalem. How long was this trip for Abraham and Isaac? How long were they on the road?
3 days.
Yes, 3 days. Genesis 22:4. 3 days, and some commentators say 45 miles it took them. So can you imagine Isaac basically looking around for 3 days and not seeing anything to be sacrificed, and asking his dad what's going to happen? So
Can you imagine what he said whenever Abram bound him and placed him on the altar?
Yep. We can only imagine.
Usually when you're 115, you can't take a 45-mile hike either. So.
Yeah.
Or take a 15-year-old down.
We don't know. I'm almost thinking that Isaac just got up on the altar. I don't think Abram had to fight it for it.
Well, it says he bound him.
Yeah, he did bind him, yeah.
Still.
Sherry?
One of the arguments I heard at some point was that Isaac was glad his dad bind him because he was a good obedient son.
Yeah,
So he just go, okay, Dad, you want to tie me up? Okay, you're.
yeah. I mean, we don't know. We're just thinking. So.
As far as what Abraham said, it's actually recorded. When Isaac,
Yeah.
that we do know.
Yeah, that we do know. So why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac? If you read the story on pages 19 and 20 of the book.
I think it was to be a foretelling of what Christ would do, because God's only son also died. And he even makes a reference in Genesis there about it was like he was dead and came back to life, just like Jesus, died and came back to life. So it seemed like he was actually kind of preparing us for that story.
That's one of the answers I have, as a foreshadow of God sacrificing his own son. Anything else?
I would have to think that it's an example for
people to buy into that were in the family that came afterwards, his willingness to have such faith.
Okay, and it's an example to us too, though, right? To provide an example of absolute obedience, what I have.
Also think the verse I was talking about earlier where Abraham answered Isaac, that's really another thing too that God wanted to remind him very solidly that he is going to be father of a great nation.
Yeah.
There's a promise here. This is a very solid reminder of that promise.
Yeah, to validate Abraham as the father of all who have faith in God. So yeah, y'all are right on track. Y'all doing good. Anything else?
I think one other thing too is that sometimes we can make our children into idols.
Yeah,
He wanted this child so badly.
yeah,
And maybe he was testing.
yeah. And that was my other point, to test Abraham's faith.
And was Abraham's faith in God, or was Abraham's faith been transferred to Isaac?
Exactly.
And we know here that it was in God.
Yeah. So afterward, what did Abraham call that place? Page 20.
The Lord will provide.
The Lord will provide. What's the Greek on that, or Hebrew on that? You ever heard the term Jehovah Jireh? You ever heard of Jehovah
You
Jireh?
heard that Gary sermon this morning, right?
That sounds German to me. Ma'am?
In the video, he said possibly the angel was
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have heard that. I didn't.
He's from Texas, though.
I don't have an answer on that. Can I circle around to next week?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, he said possible.
Yeah. So why did God choose to spare Isaac's life from the sacrifice?
He was the promise.
Okay. Page 20.
Because Abraham did not withhold his son from God.
Okay. Genesis 22:12 says that you truly fear God. Y'all see that? Everybody see that?
Now I know that you fear God.
Yeah. Is this a physical fear? Does Abraham think that God was going to zap him or strike him dead or something? No, this was an attitude of reverence and respect. I know the second bells are ringing. Hold on. What did Abraham and Isaac learn from this experience? Showed that Isaac belonged to God, and Isaac, all those who should come from him, his descendants, have been given to God. It showed to Abraham and to all the people after him that God did not wish children or men killed his offering. So, what other religious group uses this story, but with a different ending? Not in the book. What other religious group uses this story, but with a different ending? Gary hinted about it earlier. Yeah, the Islam faith believes it was Ishmael that was put on the altar, not Isaac. Yeah. Really? Yeah, that's what I read.
I don't know where in the world they would get that from.
So, as we go through pages 21 and 22, this story comes from Genesis 25 through 27. Abraham and Sarah die. Isaac marries Rebekah. Rebekah gives birth to twins. Esau, the elder brother, is Isaac's favorite. Jacob is Rebekah's favorite. Jacob sells a meal, and sales is in quotations, a meal to his brother in exchange for Esau's birthright. Rebekah helps trick Isaac into giving Jacob his blessing. Esau finds out and becomes angry and plans to kill Jacob. Rebekah sent Jacob to live with relatives until Esau's anger diminished. And Jacob was tricked by his uncle Laban into marrying Leah before marrying Rachel. Y'all remember that story? Then we skip to Genesis 32, Verse 3, Jacob sends messengers to Esau asking for forgiveness, page 22 in your book. In verse 32:6, the messengers return and tell Jacob that Esau is coming to meet him and doing what?
400 guys.
Hey, bringing 400 people with him.
Not just people. These are
Probably
Fighting-
military people.
fighting
No,
men,
just
yeah.
says men. So how did Jacob prepare for his meeting with Esau? Page 22.
separated out his camp,
All right.
and he sent gifts.
Well,
He got worried, is what he
I
said.
got to, he was panicking what he was doing. The 400 men coming, he was looking out. Why did he separate his family into two groups? I remember.
In case they got killed off.
Yeah, if he lost one family, he still have another family. So that's what he was doing.
Of course, he didn't realize that Esau could also have divided his 400 into 200.
Exactly. Yeah.
You think he was acting out of faith when he did that?
No, he was fear. That was fear there.
It does say that Jacob was afraid and he divided them, and then he finally remembered, ooh, I need to pray, and then
Yeah.
he prayed.
It was kind of an afterthought, though.
Yeah.
So when Jacob wrestled with the man through the night, what did he want from him? What did he want from this man?
And a blessing.
What, Sherry or Christy?
His name.
Deborah's correct, but
Yeah, he wanted a blessing.
Wanted his name is what he asked him.
Yeah, he wanted that. Was this an angel or was this God wrestling with him? This is different than your question, right? Okay. Just want to make sure. We don't know. He's just referenced as a man. Some commentators think it may be God himself that he was wrestling with. Most people think of just an angel in a man's body. This man changed Jacob's man to Israel. Jacob sent flocks and herds to his brother Esau, page 24. Esau accepted the gifts, but later God tells Jacob that his name will be Israel, to be fruitful and increase in number. Genesis 35:19, Rachel dies during childbirth. How many sons did Jacob have? And with how many women did he have these 12 sons? 4. Leah, Rachel's servant Bilhah, and Leah's servant Zilpah. Any questions, comments about today's lesson?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
the belief that Ishmael was the one on the altar comes from a misunderstanding of the term one and only son.
Okay.
They know that he was the one and only son for over a dozen years, and so that's why they believe he was the one and only son offered on the altar.
Yeah, he was the oldest of all of them, and like you say, he was the one and only for 11 or 12 years. So, yeah, that's where they get that. And it's just the Islam faith, Islam religion, too.
They believe Isaac, but the name was confused later by scholars
Oh, okay.
in their
Okay.
scriptures.
So next week's God's story of promise and prosperity moves from Jacob to his son Joseph. Clearly the favorite of the 12 sons. Your homework, read lesson 3 before class. Because as you notice, we don't go word for word or paragraph for paragraph. This is a summary of what we're doing, a survey of what we're doing. So it's relying on you to have read the lesson ahead of time so you sort of kind of know what's going on when you get here. Any final thoughts or questions? Gary?
I just mentioned on this subject, 9 were in the children's church.
Yeah. Rhonda told me. You need more books?
I will.
Okay, just let me know.
It was great, and at the end, when I came back here, I don't know if any of you in the back heard, you know what they were singing? Father Abraham. Yeah, yeah.
Hosea tells us
No,
that
I don't.
that Jacob wrestled with an angel. That's why.
Yeah, okay. That's what I think.
My Bible says man capitalized,
Yeah.
it says God.
Yeah, but in Hosea it says this was an angel.
Do you think that if Jacob hadn't have feared Esau, then it would have still turned out okay? Because it sounds like Esau when he met Jacob, he was like, he embraced him.
Yeah, he ran and hugged him, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and he didn't even want the gifts that Jacob offered.
Exactly.
So it seems like he was worried for no reason.
It was. And is that true? That's true for us today, isn't it? We worry about 99% of the things we have no control over.
And that don't happen.
And they don't have to. You're absolutely right. Everyone have a safe week, a blessed week. Seniors, singles, have to eat lunch. I guess if you're a senior.